The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
Now, Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits back into building more renewables around the UK. And with the news that the price cap is going to be going up again in January, now is the time to consider switching to Fuse.
And you can sign up on getfuse.com/politics. Use the referral code politics. And the Black Friday deal means that if you sign up now, you can get £30 off the first month when signing up to Fuse's fixed tariff.
And that's just for TRIP listeners. What's more, on top of that, you get a tariff that's £70 cheaper a year than the new fixed price cap. Therefore, TRIP listeners will save £100 by switching during this week. That's a limited time offer, so do act quickly. They also now offer a brand new feature, 24/7 support. They promise they'll answer your message within a minute on the Fuse app.
So download it now. Use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
There's a lot going on the international front. And if you think about COP, about Israel and the International Criminal Court, about Ukraine, I wonder if a way we can look at it is through the lens of whether the international organizations are remotely up to the job that they're trying to do.
Let's put those three things just together for an instant, just to frame them in an obvious way, which is, if we go back to the 90s, early 2000s, I think all those things coincide. It was a period where it really felt as though there was a strong push to build international institutions. So you'll remember that we created the International Criminal Court in Yugoslavia, and that was also the moment at which the international criminal courts in general that we're going to be talking about today emerged. The UN felt pretty strong. It was a time when the British economy was performing strongly. GDP per capita growth was, for the first time since 1870, growing faster than the US. And it was a time when we all looked to countries like Norway as forms of utopia, which a lot of our policy was arranged around. So that's a kind of good background. Let's start, though, maybe with a bit of a summary on where we are on the ICC. Just to remind people, there are two different international courts that people will hear about a lot. There's the ICJ, which is the International Court of Justice, which rules on relationships between states on behalf of the UN. And that actually has also featured in the debate about Israel-Gaza because it ruled on illegal occupation of Gaza and it's discussing genocide. The other court that matters, which is a more recent court, which is the ICC, which was set up by something called the Rome Statutes through negotiations that actually had been going on almost since the First World War, but finally came into fruition in the early 2000s, rules on individuals. And the controversy there is that traditionally it ruled on individuals, and the Washington Post has made this point in slightly disturbing terms. The Washington Post basically wrote an editorial saying, no, this court was supposed to be ruling on people in Africa. It's not supposed to be ruling on people in the developed world. And that's one of the reasons why the Global South has traditionally been a bit uncomfortable with the International Criminal Court. It made its reputation going after people who'd committed war crimes in Africa, most dramatically of all the president of Sudan, but it also ruled against, has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. And of course, so long as it was doing that, broadly speaking, the US and Europe were pretty comfortable with it. What it's now done, of course, is issue arrest warrants for Hamas leaders, but unfortunately, the Hamas leaders it's issued warrants for have subsequently been killed by Israeli operations, and it's also issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and for Gallant, the Defense Secretary, who just stepped down. And in relation to that, much of the world has been very, very divided, with the Global South generally embracing this, and the Muslim world very much embracing this decision. But many other countries, most notably the US, criticizing the decision of the ICC and refusing to accept it. Over to you.
I mean, it's the first time that what is defined as a Western leader of a developed democracy has been charged in this way. As you say, we're talking in the past about Bashir in Sudan, Taylor in Liberia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So this is a really, really big deal. With some exceptions, it seems to have united Israeli politics against the ICC. But I do think this just goes to the heart of how diplomacy has always been political to some extent. But when you look at the reactions around the world, and there's a very good mapping of the whole decision by an organization called Just Security. And they've gone country by country through all the different reactions that people have made to this. So as you say, America, even before the work was done on the case, even right from the start, they said this is unacceptable. It's putting Israel on a par with Hamas. And given what Hamas did on October the 7th, that is completely unacceptable. And they've stuck absolutely to that line. Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, immediately invited Netanyahu to say, essentially, come to our country because there's no chance whatever that we're going to arrest you. Because what happens is if you're a signatory to the ICC and somebody is indicted by it, then when they try to visit your country, you should arrest them. South Africa, for example, very interesting example, where I think it was Bashir who went to South Africa and wasn't arrested, and the South African Supreme Court judged its own government to have been in breach of international law for the failure to arrest. So just as, remember Putin didn't go to South Africa for the meeting of the BRICS last year because he was worried about arrest. He did go to Mongolia quite recently because the Mongolian government had told him they were not going to arrest him. But what's happened when you look at the list of the countries who have said this is a good thing? Turkey, by the way, Erdogan was essentially sort of celebrating this. And then you look, so there's those countries that have often been critical of Israel in the past. Ireland's another one, came out very, very strongly saying it has to be supported. Then you see the ones that sort of basically are just conscious of the very difficult politics. UK, I would put in that category. France is in that category, where they find it very, very difficult. So it's a really interesting development, but it just shows the extent of polarization now, even around something like this.
And I think you framed this at the beginning as a statement about international law and the international system. So we're in a world that is much, much more violent than it was when Trump took over in 2016. When Trump took over in 2016, the Middle East was pretty peaceful. Eastern Europe was pretty peaceful. Africa was in a reasonably good state. We're now in a world in which there is horrors in the Middle East, there are horrors in Ukraine, Russia, and there are horrors in Sudan, just to take three. And, we could add to that Myanmar, Nagorno-Karabakh, etc. So it's a real moment at which the international system is being tested to its limits by people like Putin breaking international borders, by civil war breaking out. And this court was really created as part of an attempt to bring peace and solve conflict by holding people accountable for war crimes. So it was set up to deal with future Saddam Hussein's, Milosevic's, Pinochet's. And the hope was that by having a clear international system in place, leaders would be deterred from committing acts of brutality. So, I think it's maybe worth taking a step or two back to see what's at stake here and why many countries, for example, Belgium, some of the Scandinavian countries have come out and said very, very strongly, there is a principle of international law here. It doesn't matter who the arrest warrant is issued for. We must support this international court. And part of the strength of these courts is that they attempt to issue arrest warrants for people on both sides. And this is why the question of equivalence is important. So the Americans and others have tried to say that the problem with this ruling is it creates an equivalence between Hamas and Israel. But that isn't a good argument. If you look at the court on former Yugoslavia, one of the things that actually gave it strength is that it issued arrest warrants not only for the Bosnian Serbs, for the Mladics and the Karadzics, who were clearly on the wrong side. It issued arrest warrants for Bosnian commander who was on the right side, because the argument was, yes, he was the victim of an illegal aggression and invasion, but in his conduct of the war to defend himself, he broke international law. The allegation was he committed atrocities. The other thing that's important is that these courts in the past, and this was true of a Croat commander, have heard cases and in the end decided that people should not be convicted. So I suppose what I'm getting at there is that you can't use the fact of equivalence as a way of challenging a court. That's a very kind of worrying grounds. The stronger case that could be made against it, which has been hinted at by some of the objections, is that the court is supposed to come into place only when the national courts and the national judiciaries are not capable of dealing with it. So the way in which the US or the UK would traditionally say it doesn't need to go to the ICC is by saying we have very strong courts in our own country which will investigate war crimes committed by our soldiers and our leaders internally. So it doesn't need to go to the ICC. And there the question is Israel still in a situation where it can honestly say that its judicial process is so strong that it will fairly investigate war crimes committed by its own people? Or are the critics correct who say, actually, in practice, if you look at Israeli judicial practice over the next 20 years, it's been very, very reluctant to hold anyone accountable
And
for
also,
war crimes.
if you go back to Israeli politics before October the 7th, then the big issue was the fact of Netanyahu and his justice reforms, which, if you remember, led to huge protests in the streets because they actually felt that the justice system was being co-opted for political purposes. I mean, look, it's very, very hard it's hard to know exactly what's happening in Gaza because it's access is so limited. But I was talking this week to somebody who's just got back from the West Bank, somewhere where this person goes regularly, has done for many, many years, has a pretty significant role to play, and does not normally speak in what I would call dramatic terms. And this person says that what's happening in the West Bank, although he thinks that it's wrong to talk about apartheid because that is very much a sort of about a specific system in South Africa. He doesn't think we should be talking in terms of genocide, but does say that what is going on there is ethnic cleansing. And in a sense that what's happening is that there is a deliberate strategy to make the place as uninhabitable as possible for people who see it as their home. And that the Ben Gvir Smotrich side of the Israeli government is absolutely in charge. Now, at this stage, always we should say October the 7th was horrific. Hamas, deserved a lot of what went their way. But have we reached that point? And is there anybody within the Israeli system that is able or willing to stand up and make the point that if the goal in Gaza was to wipe out the Hamas leadership, the fact that in this indictment, the three people who were named originally, they're all now dead. I presume that they were looking at the Hamas leadership. But what's happening in the West Bank, and there was a huge piece in the New York Times yesterday about this. They had this word Gazification, that the Gazification of what's going on in the West Bank. But if you have, and we talk a lot about the theme of impunity, and you do have a sense that because they can say we are taking out our enemies, we're taking out the people who were responsible for October the 7th, we've kind of moved to a point where you sort of feel, well, have they not for some time now going beyond that? And then the other point that's worth throwing into this about all of these international institutions, the arrival of Donald Trump, the return of Donald Trump as president. Now, given that we've all grown up with the idea that nobody is above the law in a democracy governed by the rule of law, and we've just seen arrive as president somebody who is clearly above the law, not least because of what's happened to all the cases for which he was being investigated. So I think that sense of a world of impunity, a world of nationalism, a world of where governments can kind of do what they want, I think that's where we are. And that's why these responses have all been, well, this is our national policy in relation to the issue of Israel-Gaza. Therefore, that's the line we take. So the institution itself is now fundamentally weakened.
Yes. And of course, I mean, you're speaking to us in Norway, and it's probably no accident that the countries that have come strongly out in favor of the International Court, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Canada, the Netherlands, are, I suppose, classic Northern European countries that have a strong, strong abiding commitment to the idea of trying to create international law.
When I was having breakfast with the Norwegian Prime Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, this morning, he showed me in the residence the table literally on which the Oslo Accords were signed.
To remind people, the Oslo Accords was the last really strong attempt at a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine.
Exactly. So you see this desk and you think, my God, how far have we come from that? Well, now we have elected in America a president who has just appointed an ambassador to Israel he says there is a one-state solution.
Yeah.
Of course, what a lot of this is about is that area has to be taken back. That's Judea and Samaria, and it's part of the goal of one Israel. And I fear that's kind of that will that be the American policy? I don't know, but that is certainly the view of the American ambassador.
Yeah. Just finally to finish, I mean, why is it that so many Israelis have been critical of this ruling, and it's been pretty universal. I mean, slightly shockingly, most of the opposition leaders, etc., people who traditionally one would have hoped would support international law, have come out against it. I think there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, of course, Israel feels brutally under attack still.
Yeah.
Whatever the realities on the ground are, and I actually happen to believe that Iran poses less of a threat to Israel than people suggest, but that's almost irrelevant. What matters is that people in Israel feel profoundly under threat and have since October last year, and they feel the world is ganging up against them. Secondly, of course, as we've discussed, there's very little information about what's happening in Gaza really available to Israelis, and actually even very little information. We're talking about the West Banks, about what's going on in the West Bank. Israeli citizens for a long time now have not been allowed to go to the West Bank. So I had a Jewish friend who, I think I mentioned this, traveled recently to Hebron and walked through the settlements and with a Palestinian friend was subject to unbelievable abuse and came back really shaken, feeling that he'd been lied to for his entire life about what was happening in the settlements because he literally had no idea what they were like. So there is a sense of this, that when you feel under attack, when your media is not showing you anything, and when you can't visit these areas, you can have a very unrealistic sense of what's actually going on. And you feel that people complaining about the settlements or the operations in Gaza are just anti-Semitic rather than taking seriously the possibility that you can hold the position, which I think you and I hold, which is October the 7th was a horrifying, unforgivable attack, that Hamas is a terrorist group, Hezbollah is a terrorist group, that Israel has a right to self-defense, but also that some of the things that are happening in the West Bank and much of what's been happening in Gaza is entirely unacceptable. And Israel did not need to do those things.
Every time we discuss this, we tend to get attacked from both sides. I think actually we've been a little bit slow, both of us. You probably a little bit quicker than I, but to get to a place of actually saying that a lot of what the Israeli government is doing now is wrong. And is being shown to be wrong. But and that leads to every time you say something like that, and this is what, if you saw Netanyahu's response to the ICC, he said that this was anti-Semitic. And that's a kind of easy thing to say. It's like if you were to, if ever I'm discussing Europe, anything to do with Europe, with somebody who's a well-known kind of Brexit person, they will just say, oh, well, you're a Remainer. Like that means you aren't allowed to have a view about something today, 2024. And likewise, now, if you say anything like we've just been saying about the reactions to the ICC or the fact that you should at least take it seriously, if the international institution is to mean anything, they say, well, that's being anti-Semitic. And it's just a way of shutting down any reasonable debate. And that means it's impossible to kind of make progress.
And the stakes are unbelievable, because if we end up in a situation where the US and very major allies reject the authority of the International Criminal Court, we have just dealt a death blow to one of the central institutions that was supposed to preserve global security. I mean, this is a very big stakes, which brings us, I think, onto Ukraine, which you want to discuss. So Ukraine, I think there are probably 3 or 4 issues. I wanted to come to you again on this question of whether, if Trump pulls back, whether Europe can go it alone. So just to remind people, Trump's got basically two camps pushing against involvement in Ukraine. One of them, broadly speaking, is isolationist. We don't want to have anything to do with anyone else. And the other one of which is represented by this man that I know a bit, Mike Waltz, his new national security advisor, which I'd call the priority camp, which says it isn't we want to have nothing to do with anywhere, but we want to focus on China. And that any weapons that we send to Ukraine are undermining our position on China. Now, the reason that's a problem is that there is a potential option for the US to say, we're not providing any more money, we're not going to send any more weapons. But if Europe wants to buy our weapons, they can still do so. And I put that little caveat in because Europe simply does not have the industrial production capacity. It's not just a question of cash. Europe could theoretically be a huge stretch, but if Germany, France, and Britain came in behind Poland, they could probably find the extra $50 billion a year to support the removal of US spending. The problem is we're simply not creating enough missiles, and we don't have the equivalent of Patriots. We're not able to deal with air defense properly. So would the US sell the kit? There'll be part of Trump that would say, yeah, sure, I don't want anything to do with it, but if that's money for Americans, money for American defense contractors, I'll flog it to the Europeans. Incidentally, at an inflated price, which is one of the problems that the Ukrainians have been facing. We just can't buy this American kit at the price that the defense contractors sell to the American military. But people like Mike Waltz might say, no, because actually even selling this kit removes our air defenses from the Pacific, where we want this kit in place. So let me just come to you on this, can Europe go it alone? So the Poles, the Baltics, the Nordics, Finns and Swedes particularly, would like to say, let's ally with Britain. We take this very seriously. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is genuinely a massive threat to the world. So even if Trump pulled out, we're going to step up. Do you think that's credible?
It's very, very difficult, that's for sure. And this just underlines the power that is in the position of the American presidency. I was talking to somebody who was at the G20 in Brazil, and who said that a lot of the discussions were about, well, what's it going to be like when Trump, just the same as at the COP. Trump was kind of hanging over COP, he was hanging over the G20. But one of the people who was there who'd listened in to one of the conversations that Trump had been having with one of these other leaders, in which Donald Trump said that he felt that the Ukraine situation had the capacity to be as complicated as the Middle East. Now, I thought that was interesting. Because the sense we have, I'm going to do a deal in 24 hours, is that he sort of doesn't understand any of the complexity. So we shall see. I think it'll be very, very hard for Europe, not least because of the politics in Europe. We've talked about Germany, where the hard right and the hard left parties are both against further engagement in Ukraine.
And the hard right and hard left, just to remind people, 30% of the German population currently supports these parties, which seem to not want to have anything to do with Ukraine. That's a big voting bloc.
Yeah, interestingly, here in Norway, the reason why I had a very, very early meeting with the Prime Minister was because he was heading off to Parliament, because there's a big debate today about Ukraine, where he is going to be committing $3 billion for next year. The pressure he is under is to spend more.
Yeah.
And there's none of that. There might be a little bit at the margins, but there's even from the right-wing progressives, as they call themselves, the Progress Party, there's no pressure other than to do more for Ukraine. So I think you're right about it. And they're really, really, really keen on a big strategic partnership with the UK.
Just to explain why, I think the reason why the Nordic and Baltic countries and Poland feel this very strongly is that they feel much closer to Russia, and they focus on it and they study it.
I mean, it's geography and it's history. They're staring at it the whole time.
So their conclusion is that the stakes are unbelievably high. And broadly speaking, the worst case scenario is that if Putin manages to take a chunk of eastern Ukraine and then get Trump to agree essentially to demilitarize Western Ukraine, which is what he'll demand. He'll say, the price of a peace is Western Ukraine, or what remains of Ukraine, not only doesn't join NATO and EU, but it basically disarms. He will then have two temptations, which will be very strong. One of them is to roll through Ukraine in 4 or 5 years' time and have a chomp at Moldova, which is a former Soviet state. And perhaps the more likely one is that he helps himself to a bit of one of the Baltic states. And there again, it may not be about invading and taking an entire country, maybe just taking a sliver of territory. But the reason that matters is that if he takes a sliver of territory in the Baltic, those are NATO member states. So we're signed up to defend them if they're invaded.
Yeah.
He will hope that he can take a chunk of them, sit there, and then threaten to use nuclear weapons if anyone intervenes to retake it. And if he's successful in that, he's destroyed NATO forever.
What did you make last week of him using this, first time using this kind of intercontinental ballistic missile, which could carry nuclear warheads but didn't, but was sort of, it looked to me like a pretty performative, very expensive message.
Yeah, well, I think that is the message, and I think that's the bluff he'd hope to pull off. I think his gamble is that most Germans, most Brits probably, I'm afraid, would not be prepared to fight and die to defend Baltic countries. Now, NATO is based on the assumption they would be prepared to do that. But the risk is people will think, a bit like in Chamberlain, this is a distant country of which we know nothing. Are we really going to fight and die for these countries? The Baltics are gambling we will, but much smarter from their point of view is to make sure that Putin is never in a position in Ukraine to be able to claim the victory, settle down, and then have a go at something else. Because I think a combination of taking a small bit of territory, Germany and Britain not being motivated, and nuclear threat might allow him to break NATO and that article of protection entirely.
On the other hand, let's imagine that Trump did sort of do some kind of deal with Putin that was not at all acceptable to Ukraine and that destabilized that frankly the whole of Eastern Europe and parts of the West. Does he really want that to be his first big foreign policy thing? Is that not going to show him to be weak as opposed to strong?
Well, one possibility, of course, which people who voted for him keep trying to say is, well, he never does all the things that he says he's going to do anyway. So maybe we don't need to take seriously the fact that he said this. I think, though, most of his top team have spent the last 4 years digging into the idea that Russia doesn't really matter. What matters is China. And that they could do with making friends with Putin to bring him more onto their side against China. So there'll be, whatever he thinks, there'll be a lot of pressure in his team. And I certainly think, I would imagine, I don't know, maybe you've got views on this. Do you think it's politically possible for him to write another large check for Ukraine, given everything he's said in the last 2 years? I mean, forget about peace in 24 hours, but it also depends on him. All he has to do is not send another $50 billion for Ukraine to be in really big trouble.
Yeah, I think it is possible for him to, because I don't think he has been as hard over on this as some of the people that are now in the administration. And we know that he's always prepared to switch positions. I honestly don't know, but I'll tell you what, I'm reading Angela Merkel's book at the moment.
Yeah.
And very interesting, when Trump came in, and let's say, for example, COP, obviously he had a very, very different position to most of the countries that that were at the top table of the climate change debate. And she sort of took the view, well, we're going to have to step up and meet this challenge without him in a different way. Now, I guess the question you're asking is on something like defense, would leaders be willing to do that, and would their countries be willing to follow them on that? But most of the countries we're talking about, they are increasing defense spending. Yeah. They are looking to up the game on defense, including our own, including the place where I am now, including Germany. So I think, look, it's a tough one, but I don't think it's a given that that he's going to pull the plug on Ukraine quickly.
Which brings us to some other issues that you've raised. You wanted to tell us a little bit about Norway, where you are. There's also been an extraordinary result in Romania. So tell us a little bit about Romania, because I think it's quite an interesting example about the way that politics is changing.
So this is Romania. This is the presidential campaign. And the president it's not a sort of Macron type president. They don't have as much power as some presidents. But the truth is that a far-right pro-Russia candidate, a guy called Calin Georgescu, he has won the first round on 23%. And the person who was favourite, who was the prime minister, a social democrat, came third. So he's now out of the runoff. So what happens is that Georgescu is now going to go up against somebody called Elena Lasconi from the Save Romania Union in the second round. But it's very much, I mean, this guy is, we're talking far right here. We're talking somebody who sort of regularly echoes the kind of Putin talking points. Pretty low turnout, 51%, but a big rise. I mean, this guy was on, not that long ago, was on sort of single figures in the polls.
There's a lot of trends here in Romania, which oddly reflect what we've seen in America and across Europe and what's happened to our democracy. So you just pointed out very low turnout. Number two, opinion polls completely wrong. I mean, the opinion polls has barely rated this guy. Thirdly, the power of social media. So he had no ground game. He didn't have much money. He's done it almost all entirely on TikTok, which again, you remember people like me who were profoundly wrong about Trump were trying to point out he didn't have a ground game. He didn't have people knocking on doors. He didn't have offices in Michigan. And of course, he proved that he didn't really need any of that stuff and that the Democrats' investment in that turned out to be almost a waste of money. They didn't really get much result for that. This guy has proved that you can go from almost nobody knowing who you are, none of the pollsters rating you, to actually coming first in the presidential election. And then finally, of course, what you've pointed out, which is that he is violently pro-Putin against the American missile bases in Romania, which are absolutely central for NATO security, is running on a very strong Christian ticket. He's got this line that he's been sent by God to try to revenge sins. So even if he doesn't win, and the likelihood at the moment, but who the hell is supposed to trust the opinion polls given how wrong they're getting everything? But anyway, the opinion polls suggest he may not win. Still, this phenomenon that somebody coming out of nowhere, almost certainly aided by Russian and Chinese interference coming in on TikTok, because this is a big other issue. If you think about it from Russia's point of view, a lot of the things that are happening really suit them. They love the idea that obviously a pro-Putin populist can come out of nowhere, pumped up on social media.
Yeah.
They also are really enjoying, I think, stoking up, sadly, the Israel-Palestine crisis on both sides. It really suits Russia's agenda to have social media algorithms endlessly creating tension between those two sides, because that will both build up anti-Islamist populist parties in Europe who will feed off this. And God forbid what would happen if there were another Islamist terrorist attack in Europe just before elections in France or Germany.
Maybe that's a good bridge into the UK, because one of the things that's getting a lot of attention on British social media at the moment is this petition. I don't know what it's at now, but it's a petition basically saying there should be another general election.
And it's heading towards 3 million people. And just to remind you, I mean, as an MP, we used to see these petitions. And in the old days, we debated in Parliament when they crossed 100,000 people, and getting to 100,000 was a lot of effort. And it was a sign that something really mattered.
I would say this one hasn't required much effort at all, because when you delve into it, there seems to be an awful lot of people from different parts of the world who are suddenly taking a massive interest in the need for a general election in the United Kingdom, added to which the wretched Musk has been pushing this as well. And I do think it's wonderful. I must say this. Nigel Farage, who used to get very, very aerated at the idea that we should have a people's vote, a referendum on the final Brexit deal, suddenly thinks that we should have a second vote of a general election, which delivered a massive majority, rather bigger than 52-48. So I think, but this I think is doing two things. One, it's showing the ability of the whole kind of that social media architecture to drive what I would argue is total non-news. So Keir Starmer goes on the television yesterday and does an interview where he's asked, well, you've got 2 million people saying there should be a general election. The answer to is, well, no, you don't. And likewise, somebody else saying Nigel Farage is more popular than you. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper. So I think it's just weird, but it's also these petitions now. Frankly, I think Parliament's going to have to relook at this, because these petitions are pointless. They don't actually accurately reflect, I don't think, any strand of opinion. So it means you can't really work out what's a proper petition and what's not.
It's very worrying because, of course, these petitions were part of trying to bring Parliament into the modern world. They were part of thinking about how digital democracy could work. And what we're discovering with a lot of moves on digital democracy is how easily they can be undermined by the way that social media works. Musk has driven this, and he's proving to be increasingly powerful.
Mm.
But if you step outside the UK and you look at German and Austrian social media, he is retweeting and promoting posts by far-right activists in Germany and Austria too. I mean, he is becoming a real mobilizer.
Of the far right.
And he seems to have a real bee in his bonnet for anybody that he perceives as being part of the moderate centre, hence the fact he keeps trolling Keir Starmer.
Yeah, but it was very odd because he didn't always, when he was sort of busy going around governments hoovering up massive subsidies to make himself the richest man in the world, he appeared to be quite reasonable. In fact, funny enough, I was talking to the Norwegian Prime Minister about him this morning because Tesla is a massive in Norway. They really, really have sort of driven on the electric car market. And he was saying that, he met Musk a few times, and he was over in Norway a few years ago, and he said he was kind of quite modest and quite reticent and quite almost shy. And yet he's now become this sort of radicalized weaponizer of this extraordinary social media thing. But there's a method in his madness. There's no doubt. I mean, he keeps promoting the Yaxley Lennon, the so-called Tommy Robinson. He keeps promoting his video, the one that's landed him in jail, saying Britain's now a police state. Look, I think I do think the Musk-Trump thing will end in tears, but in the meantime, he's doing an awful lot of damage to the sort of the public square in so many countries. Can we talk about the British economy, Rory? I want to throw an idea at you. Okay, so Labour's come in. We've talked for a while about how there's this very long gap of 4 months between the election and the budget. The budget's happened. The budget, they say, has been about fixing this black hole in the economy. The national insurance has gone up, and that has sort of caused quite a lot of grief. There was quite a lot of negativity at the CBI yesterday. You've had the protests of the farmers, etc. What's been lost in that, I think, has been, because if you remember, Rachel Reeves called it a budget for growth. But the growth message and the plan for growth has not landed. So here's my thought. We're now in November, December next month, then you've got Christmas, then you've got the New Year. My thought is that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves come out and in the new year say the first months of government were about fixing the mess. We've laid the foundations of that. Here is the plan for growth. And here are all the issues that we need to address, and here's where we're doing it. And there was a very, very interesting article funny enough, on Sam Friedman's Substack by John Kingman. John Kingman is somebody I used to work with very closely because he was a Treasury spokesperson during Gordon Brown's chancellorship. But then he went on to be pretty senior at the Treasury, and he was actually the growth policy guy. And he's written this very, very quite long but really interesting piece where he's gone through all the different areas that you could address in a plan for growth, some of which we talk about. Transport links, obviously, planning and infrastructure, where the government is saying the right things, but now you've actually got to show how you're doing it. Fixing the mess of Brexit, city devolution, more powers to the cities, redeveloping that whole Oxford-Cambridge corridor. He's throwing out all sorts of different ideas, which when you read them, it's actually quite dramatic. He throws another one. Are we finally? At the moment, there's yet another kind of review process around Heathrow. That's a strategic decision for a government to take, knowing that there's going to be opposition. And I'm not saying it's the right thing or wrong thing. I'm saying that, it should be part of a growth plan.
Yeah. Now, I've been criticised a lot, as you can imagine, by colleagues who feel that I've not been clear enough and haven't played my role of devil's advocate, being a bit critical of Labour. And that's partly because I've been trying to encourage you on this painful journey of finding things that you can occasionally point out that Labour's not doing well. So let me just give a brief explanation of the sort of bleak facts about where Labour is. Keir Starmer is on a popularity rating at the moment of minus 38. Mm-hmm. To put that in contrast, Tony Blair, at about this stage, his government had a approval rating 76 in favour, 13 against. So sort of net popularity about plus 63 against minus 38. So Keir Starmer is almost as unpopular as Liz Truss was by this stage, and that's quite an achievement. The economy is not doing well. The pound is slightly down, business confidence is down, retail's down, manufacturing activity is now at a 9-month low. The Purchasing Managers Index, which is a good indicator of growth, has now gone into negative territory. Private sector activity in general, 13-month low. Budget. In retrospect, the budget, although big, and we pointed this out, £70 billion extra spending, £40 billion extra tax, had investment spending, but that investment spending is mostly going towards things like schools and hospitals, which is very understandable. And my goodness, they need investment, but is not the obvious thing if you're trying to get your economy off the ground.
And a lot will go on pay as well.
A lot on pay as well, yeah. But what isn't there? There's been no tax reform. There's nothing obviously there for growth. And it's very difficult to understand where she goes in a couple of years, because although she's put spending up by 3.4%, if Rachel Reeves does not get growth, there's not going to be revenue coming into her coffers, and she's going to have a very, very uncomfortable spending conversation. In other words, she's going to have to basically cut spending in 2 years' time. And she's ruled out tax increases yet again. No more tax increases, Parliament. That doesn't seem realistic, I'm afraid. She's going to have to probably break her word again.
Or maybe she goes actually, at some point in this Parliament, goes in the opposite direction, makes tax changes in the opposite direction, not necessarily on income, but on some of the kind of, on some of the business taxes and the entrepreneurial stuff. I mean, I think, but what do you think of it? Is it too late, 6 months into your first Parliament, to come out and say, right, here's the plan for growth? Is it too late to do that if you've had the budget?
It's not too late. And I guess the optimistic view is that Keir Starmer, a bit like Churchill's joke about America, is often considered to eventually do the right thing, but at the very last moment.
Yeah.
But doing the right thing is all the things that you've mentioned, which are largely investment, but it's also reform to trade policy, competition, education, regulation, and the tax system. Right, there should have been reform in this budget to capital gains tax. Fuel should have gone up. What they did on stamp duty rise is completely mad. And what they did on ENI, which is basically raising the tax on employing people, is again very bad policy. It's driven a wedge between self-employed and employed people in a very unhelpful way. So absolutely, they can still do it. But that was a budget which, when you look at it, increasingly looks like a sticking plaster budget that avoided making the big reform choices. And that's the question. Why, with a huge majority, did they not take the opportunity to be bold?
Here's where I'm going to be constructively critical, Rory. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we did, both of us, because the numbers were so big. We thought, this is big, it's bold, and therefore it's interesting and it's going to move the dial. And as you know from the events that we've done together with business, there's still a lot of goodwill. They really want this government to succeed. But, the tank, you've got to be very, very careful about running down the reserves in your kind of reputational bank. So I think they've got to, at the moment, their messaging is essentially, we're doing really tough things because we've got no choice, and they've got to move from that to we're making really big positive choices because we've got a really clear and compelling plan for growth. And I think you come out in the new year and you say, right, transport, there were some of the most important transport links were cut. Right, we're going to invest in that. Infrastructure, that means absolutely cutting through lots of the kind of regulatory stuff. They're going to have to fix the damage of Brexit. I'm sorry, I will keep banging on about this, but it won't be enough to tinker on that one. Likewise, I think on migration, that figure you keep quoting, which is absolutely haunting. When the pension started, 20 working people for every pensioner. It's now under 3 for every. That's just impossible to fix that without an honest debate about migration. One of John Kingman's ideas, by the way, and this would be politically very difficult, but if we are going to move away from fuel consumption in terms of driving, is it time to think about road pricing? Is something he brought in, which I know there'd be absolute sort of, people would go bonkers about that. But is that the sort of big, bold thing you need to do? The other thing, Jonathan Reynolds is developing this industrial strategy. That, I think, is where you can put in the stuff that you're talking about. But I think it's coming along and say we've got a big majority, therefore we're going to do big things because we're going to make big change in this country. At the moment, it just feels too much like we're fixing a mess. Now, we know they're fixing a mess, but the big, bold plans for the future are what we need to hear.
And I think there's a really interesting question of how you do this, because, of course, there's howls of pain if you reform anything. There's always losers. And we've seen the trouble they've got into just with farming.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether, does it make sense to put all the things together? inflict all the pain at once quite early. So let's say you're doing planning reform, tax reform, all the other competitiveness reforms, regulation reform, and all those infrastructure investments you're talking about. Or is that dangerous? I mean, could you just rip off the Band-Aid, accept weeks of the media dredging up every single person who's negatively affected, but lean into that? Because I guess presumably that's what the Thatcher government would have felt like in 84, 85, when they were really pushing ahead with stuff, that they must have had an incredible incoming barrage of abuse, from which, to some extent, their reputations haven't recovered even 30 years later. But they did go on to win the next election, and they did achieve huge reforms in the economy.
And also, Thatcher's reputation as a kind of, a leader of consequence who made real change, whether you liked the change or you didn't, is secure in history. So I think if you're in power and you've got a big majority, you've got to do big things. And no, I sort of feel very, very strongly the need for something really big coming out of the new year that essentially is learning a few lessons from the first few months, but ultimately saying we've got a big majority and we're going to do big things with it, and we're going to take a lot of heat along the way. The final point on it is John Kingman, again, sorry to keep quoting, but I thought it was an excellent piece. He says the case for the arts needs to travel the same policy journey as the case for spending on science. Over 25 years or so, the science budget went from being a minor spending programme of obscure interest to boffins to being seen by all political parties as an important economic engine. We have to see the arts in the same way. And I think the world's open for that. So listen, Rory, should we finally close off a little bit on Norway?
So very quickly before we go to little summary on Norway, why we're focusing on it. In some ways, one of the great pin-ups of the world, and something that the Labour government might well subconsciously be trying to make Britain a little bit more like, because it's leading the world in human development indicators, does fantastically well in PISA on education, 89,000 a year GDP per capita, greater quality indicators on the Gini coefficient, sovereign wealth fund of over $1 trillion. But curiously, even Norway is facing some problems that will be familiar to American and British listeners. Housing affordability, immigration now at 20%, quite a high tax burden, some grumbles about the decentralized health service, and still quite dependent on oil and gas. Anyway, over to you for what you learned.
I also think Norway is very important to Britain. We now get a third of our energy from Norway. That is a hell of a lot, 1/3. So this is a country, population-wise, roughly the size of Scotland. And we're getting a third of our energy from Norway. We have very, very important defence links with Norway. It was interesting, Johannes Gahr Støre, he's one of the left of centre politicians. And as you say, you look at all the data for Norway and you think, wow, that's pretty impressive, that's pretty good. And the Sovereign Wealth Fund, by the way, which is the biggest in the world, it now funds a quarter of all state services. One of the arguments in the politics is that we should be able to take even more from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but they have a fiscal rule that says you can only take, I think it's 3% each year. But they've also got political issues. So the incumbent party, the Labour Party, in coalition with the centre. And last week there was a poll for the first time. It's a sort of far right party in that it's to the right of the Conservative Party, called Progress. For the first time, they're top of the polls, 25.3. They've got more support than Labour and the Centre Party, which is the smaller coalition party. They're on 22.9, and the Conservative Party is on 21. So you put 21 and 25 together, that's the right. So this is, it's going to be difficult. Now, he's a very impressive guy, and he certainly thinks he can pull it round. And the other thing, this relates to America. This stuff about young men, what's happening to young men in politics is really, really quite interesting. And they had a big commission several years ago now, where they were looking at men in relation to physical health, mental health, falling behind in schools, suicide rates, all this sort of thing. And this sense that men are falling behind women, or that it's all been about women's rights and we need to have more about men. So there was one survey, for example, said that 47% of Norwegian men aged 18 to 29 said they would have voted for Trump.
Right.
Now, the overall figure in Norway is sort of 80% plus Harris. But almost half of young men
Yeah.
Now, what's that? What is that they're tapping into? How is that being
Yeah.
weaponized
And,
in that
and,
way?
and of course, it's very worrying, isn't it? Because the story when it was the elderly that supported right-wing groups was that ultimately demography was against them.
Yeah.
When it's the young supporting right-wing groups, you begin to worry that the right-wing groups have a sort of a long-term future if those people remain right-wing through their lives.
And also, there's a guy here called Simon Vella who's 23, and he's not in Parliament. He's going to go for Parliament. But this is a guy. He's been very open about taking drugs. He's been convicted for possession of soft drugs. But he's become like a big figure. There's another one in the Conservative Party, a guy called Olas Fennerby. He's 27. And they're tapping into this idea that if you want to be cool and you want to be hip, it's on the right rather than the left that you do that. And the thing that was interesting talking to Jonas this morning, he's a very, very, very intelligent guy, and he really thinks quite deeply about stuff. And he was saying that, take Canada, for example. We talked last week, and he'd heard our discussion about Justin Trudeau that we both think is in real trouble. But Trudeau had told him that a couple of years ago, when you polled Canadians on the issues of most concern to them, climate was number one. Okay. It's now vanished. The cost of living has driven out everything. So every incumbent government is having to address this cost of living stuff. And here in Norway, he says the real political problems have started because there's been a series of interest rate rises. He thinks in the new year that will start to reverse. And even though you're not responsible for them, he says he's getting the blame for all of it.
Well, finally, just tell us a little bit about what's happening with the monarchy and these espionage cases.
Oh my God, Rory. You want to talk about a monarchy that's in trouble. You, of all people, Rory.
I'm actually very much in favour of the British monarchy. It's not that I'm universally in favour of all monarchies.
Right, okay. But you're probably quite keen on the Norwegian monarchy. Well, let's do the spying one first. They've arrested a security guard working in the American embassy here on suspicion of spying for the Russians and the Iranians. So that's all kind of happening. And the royal story is the son of the Crown Princess, who's currently in custody on rape charges and domestic violence and violating a restraining order. So, certainly our royals have had difficulties down the years, and Andrew in particular has had all sorts of stuff going on. But this is he's 27, had issues with drugs, but he's currently in the nick. And that one goes on. Well, maybe a more positive note to end on, Rory, the Christmas tree.
Oh, yes. There was some grumbles about... So Norway traditionally honours its long-standing relationship with Britain and actually our cooperation during the war, famously by sending this enormous tree that goes to Trafalgar Square. And
Correct.
People like my mother who remember it first arriving after the war, it's like an incredibly exciting thing. But I believe there was some disappointment last year about the state of the tree.
Well, so I've checked into this, and in fact, I'm looking at a picture of it now. Yeah, I think I might make it my tree of the day. Essentially, this thing has to be chopped down, and then it has to be transported across the sea. So by the time it goes up in Trafalgar Square, it can look a bit sort of, like luggage that you've just sort of pulled out your suitcase. And of course, what happens is that our wretched newspapers, what they did last year was they took pictures of it, and they had it looking at its most ragged. So they've gone to great lengths this year to get a tree that they hope will transport well, hope will look good, and will thereby strengthen Anglo-Norwegian relations even further.
It's also our view, this is me as a bit of a conifer geek, our views on which trees make good Christmas trees have also changed over the last 70, 80 years. So this is a Norwegian spruce, which is a magnificent tree in Norway, and indeed if planted in Scotland, but it is no longer the tree of choice for domestic Christmas trees because it doesn't quite have the tight form that we're used to. We're increasingly using different forms of things, Caucasian firs, other forms of spruce.
Yeah, well, I think we should be, when the tree comes out of its wrapping and it goes up, I am looking at it now in its full glory, and it's a very, very impressive tree. So just give it a few days to kind of get back to the shape. Daily Mail, lay off. There are big issues at stake here. Let's just say, for example, the Norwegians get fed up with our press criticizing their Christmas tree, and as a result, decide that there's a massive frigate deal in the offing at the moment, and we're one of 4 countries that might be up for it. Biggest defence deal, right? So let's not ruin it, Daily Mail. Let's think about the jobs and prosperity of the future. Be kind to the tree.
Super. Well, thank you, Alastair. Looking forward very much to getting into climate in tomorrow's episode.
See you soon.
See you. Bye-bye.